They were back in Mr. Jackson's car, sitting and waiting. Sitting, waiting, and watching the church. They'd been there nearly an hour, and Simon Pickle was getting restless. "It's not all fun and games being a detective," Mr. Jackson said, after a long silence. Simon didn't reply. He was playing a game on his phone. But he was losing, and it annoyed him. He couldn't concentrate. "I've sat like this for days on end waiting for a suspect to turn up," Mr. Jackson added. Simon grunted. Chasing ghosts for a living had at first seemed like an interesting job, very different from working in a supermarket like his mother. But hanging around all day doing nothing, that's what let it down. "I sometimes bring a book to read, or a newspaper, or the file of my next case." Simon looked up at the church. It was as deserted as before. "Are all your cases like this?" "No, not all of them, but they usually deal with ex-murderers." Simon put his phone away. "What about that man Crippen?" Mr. Jackson grinned. "Ah, you spotted his photograph in my office, did you?" Simon nodded. "The strange case of Dr. Crippen. There are some that say he didn't do it. The trial evidence is said to have been a little shaky." "Do what?" "Dr. Crippen was hanged for the murder of his second wife. He is supposed to have killed her and buried her under the floor in the cellar of his house in London. But the police found little evidence. No head or limbs were discovered. A small section of skin from her torso, marked with a scar, was unearthed. It was enough to send Crippen to the gallows. They liked hanging people in the old days, didn't they?" Mr. Jackson brushed a speck of dirt off the sleeve of his beige jacket. "Murder was a capital offence back then. By that I mean the punishment given for homicide, if proved guilty, was death by hanging. They don't do that anymore." "What happens to murderers nowadays?" "They go to prison for what is called life, but it may only be 20 years, often less." "That's not life," Simon protested. "No, it's not. There are many that would welcome a return to the death penalty. A life sentence is decided by a judge who weighs up the severity of the crime and determines the time the guilty party remains locked up. In some cases, the prison term can seem very short." "So they can get out and kill again, I suppose?" "That does happen, yes." Simon shifted on the leather seat. "Seems all wrong to me. They should still hang 'em, and then they couldn't kill again." "People have called for its return, but I doubt the death penalty will ever come back. There have been too many miscarriages of justice over the years where innocent people, like possibly Dr. Crippen, have been switched off, as the old expression goes. From a paranormal perspective, it doesn't make any difference. Murderers come back to murder again anyway, like John George Haigh, now the Reverend Jack Willoughby of Malton Church." "So what about Dr. Crippen?" "What about him?" Simon wrestled with his thoughts. "Will he come back to kill again?" "That's a very good question. Personally, I don't think so, but he might. He's a bit different from the acid bath murderer. The jury found him guilty of murder, and he was hanged in November 1910. Yet, as I say, he may have been innocent." "So why is his picture on your wall?" Mr. Jackson flicked a fly that had settled on the steering wheel. "In his case, I need to find the reincarnated Crippen and determine if he was a murderer or not. If he was guilty, I can tick him off the list as harmless." "Do you know where he is?" Mr. Jackson laughed. "That's the continual bane of my investigations, Simon. I have no idea. Ghosts are not listed in the telephone directory. They don't necessarily return to their old stomping ground or turn up near the place where they died. How much easier would it be if they did? Ghosts can come back anywhere." Simon wound down the car window a bit more and inhaled some fresh air. "How can you be sure the vicar is the acid bath murderer?" "Call it a hunch, if you like. I needed to see his face to start with. You saw for yourself how similar the vicar is to Haig's photograph. Of course, that isn't enough on its own. Plenty of people facially resemble old murderers. I need to gather more information to be sure. Simon shrugged. So the vicar might not be the ghost of Mr. Haig after all? He might not, but there are things to suggest that he is. Simon waited for the detective to continue, but Mr. Jackson was watching something in the corner of his eye, reflected in the rear view mirror. Simon turned round, and they saw the very man they had been talking about, strolling down the lane towards them. The vicar, dressed in his black robes as before, slowed to a stop when he saw the Morris traveller. It was a memorable car. Mr. Jackson leapt out, telling Simon to wait there. The detective hastened to the vicar, but the priest turned abruptly and bolted down a path back to the church. Mr. Jackson called out to him, but the robed man waved a hand, indicating he was too busy to stop. The detective returned to the car. "What happened?" Simon asked. "I don't think he wants to see me," Mr. Jackson replied. "He deliberately avoided you." "That is so." Simon wound up his window again and shivered. The vicar's likeness to the black and white photograph in the detective's office was uncanny, and it ruffled him. Suddenly, chasing ghosts had lost its appeal. "Fancy a fizzy drink and a doughnut?" the detective asked, noting Simon's troubled expression. Simon nodded. Anything to get out of there. "I reckon he is the ghost of Mr. Haig," he said, after a beat. "What makes you say that?" Mr. Jackson asked, turning the key in the ignition and swinging the car round to make an awkward three-point turn. "He looks evil. I felt the same chill down my spine seeing him just now as I did yesterday." "That's hardly proof." "All right. Why do you think he's the ghost of that Haig bloke?" Simon demanded, as the car turned right at the roundabout. "It's not conclusive, but I had a report this morning that one of his parishioners has gone missing, and nobody can find her." Simon stared at Mr. Jackson. "Yeah, well, perhaps we're too late, and he's already melted her down in that bath of acid of his." Join me again next time, and I'll read the next chapter of The Ghost Detective.